Oh, well, thank you. I've said this to Lois already, but I'm very grateful to be here with you today. I live in Washington State, where assisted suicide is also legal, and I'm over 65, so I'm actually glad to be anywhere. But that ageism, thank you. That ageism is one of the things I want to talk about. Actually, I want to talk about four things. First, the principled moral, ethical arguments against physician-assisted suicide. I think these are sound and persuasive. I'm sure many of you will think so as well. I won't spend very much time on them because in our secular society, moral statements are dismissed as being only about our feelings. And they're often not enough to prevail in a policy debate, though they are the convictions that are held by the base of those who oppose this agenda. So second, I want to review what laws like the Oregon law really do in practice, based in your experience here and in a couple of other states. Third, I want to comment on what the future may hold in our national debate on this very important issue. And finally, I want to conclude with my own reflections on what I think this debate is really about as an issue for our society. So first, the moral equation. To begin with religious viewpoints, the Jewish and Christian traditions have rejected suicide and assisted suicide over many centuries, seeing them as destruction of God's precious gift of life and as dishonoring the Creator who gave us that life. The commandment, "Thou shalt not kill," forbids killing myself as well. I'm a human person with innate dignity, made by God in His image and likeness. St. Augustine pointed this out 17 centuries ago in his book, The City of God. If I'm commanded to love my neighbor as myself, I have to love and respect my own life if I'm to love and respect the lives of others. So I treat myself as well as I would treat someone else. I hasten to add that in this tradition, personal responsibility for this evil can be reduced or even eliminated by personal and psychological factors. And that's as true of people who are considering assisted suicide during illness as during any other crisis. They can have duress, feelings of hopelessness, psychological conditions like depression, which can distort judgment. We've dealt with suicidal depression in my own family, and people who haven't experienced don't necessarily understand. It creates a tunnel vision in which death itself wrongly seems to be the only solution to people's problems. Psychiatrist Aaron Cariotti talks about the studies that have been done of people who tried to kill themselves by jumping off the Golden Gate Bridge in San Francisco and who survived. There isn't much record of anybody trying it a second time, interestingly. And one fellow who this happened to, he survived the jump, and he told those who interviewed him for the study, you know, just after I jumped, I realized that all the problems that led me to do that had solutions, except for the fact that I just jumped. That means that in any case of assisted suicide, the people who provide vulnerable persons with these conditions, with the means to take their own lives, or even encourage them to use those means, have by far the greater guilt. Assisting a suicide in most states in the Union is a crime, is often a felony. Killing yourself or trying to kill yourself is not. Trying to kill yourself is a reason for people to get there with support and counseling and sometimes mental health care. But assisting someone else's suicide is a show of disrespect for life that requires the operation of the law. But now moving to non-religious points of view, we can see our first and most basic right is the right to life, which our founding documents call unalienable. Founders listed the basic rights as first life, then liberty, then pursuit of happiness, because they knew it's impossible to pursue happiness unless you have the liberty to choose a way of life. And it's also impossible to have liberty unless you're alive to practice it. If somebody says you have the right to vote, but on the way to the voting booth, I can kill you, then you do not have a right to vote, or any other right. So I cannot promote your freedom by helping you to destroy your life, because I destroy with your life all possible future freedom. When we're very sick, those freedoms may be limited. They may include largely ways of dealing with the physical circumstances that can't be changed. But they're not zero, and death means zero. So I promote your freedom by stopping you from killing yourself and helping you to recapture your appreciation for the things you can continue to do and enjoy in your life. Our opponents ask, whose life is it anyway? And you're supposed to say, well, it's mine. My personal answer as a believer is that it belongs to God, and we're called to respect it and exercise careful stewardship over it. But a non-religious person should at least be able to see that my bodily life is not just another possession like others. If it were, I would have a right to do whatever I want with it. I could sell myself into slavery, and that's against the Constitution, not just against the law. It is not something of mine, it is me in my earthly reality. And to kill myself is to destroy not only a piece of property, but the person that you are claiming is the property's owner. Finally, we have a moral tradition of many centuries in the medical profession against doctor-assisted suicide. The Hippocratic Oath says, I will not give a fatal drug to anyone if I am asked, nor will I suggest any such thing. That oath predates Christianity by centuries. Hippocrates was born in the 5th century before Christ. But the oath and the Hippocratic tradition were taken up by the early Christians because they recognized in it an insight into what a healing profession needs in order to win respect as a profession not just a technical specialty, something that professes the inner dignity of the patient and to commit oneself only to heal and care for that patient. That did not used to be true in the rest of pagan society at the time of Hippocrates. The doctor was the person you went to help get you over a poisoning and to help you to poison your enemies. And Hippocrates said, no, this is not just a skill that you use for killing or healing. This is about a profession of healing. That tradition's under attack today, and that means the whole idea of medicine as a profession is under attack. It does persevere in the ethical codes of most medical societies, including the American Medical Association's statement that physician-assisted suicide is incompatible with the physician's role as healer. I should note the AMA position is under attack, and there are people who are trying to get it changed with the outcome that's not certain at this time. So these moral and medical traditions are compelling to many of us. Today, they're not sufficient very often to withstand the heavily funded campaigns to legalize assisted suicide, which succeeded in Oregon in 1994 with the law taking effect at the end of 97. In Washington, where I now live, in 2008, then Vermont, California, Colorado, District of Columbia, and as of a couple of days ago, Hawaii. So, supporters of these laws, in the face of the moral argument, will say, well, your ancient moral traditions may be fine for you, but you can't impose them on me. What I care about is the freedom to control how my life ends and the ability to avoid intolerable pain and suffering as death approaches. The law should allow me to live by my more flexible moral code. So that's the pro-assisted suicide argument in a nutshell. It's all about choice and compassion. And that's why the organization promoting this has named itself Compassion and Choices, because they did marketing research. It sounds a lot more benign than its old title of the Hemlock Society, which sounded like executing Greek philosophers. So, our burden in this debate is to show this agenda is not about compassion, and it's not about the patient's choice. It's about something else. And to understand that, we need to understand how these laws really work and what their real effects are. Many people who like the idea of death with dignity in the abstract will turn against a proposal when they realize how dangerous it is. This agenda is about fear, fear of an undignified and painful death. If people support those laws from fear of those things, they need two things. They need to know that many of those fears are misplaced, that there is real care available, palliative care and other options. But they also need to know that the laws promoting this is something we should be equally or more afraid of. So, what the laws do. Let's look at the Oregon law. It's been hailed as a model and has been the model for most of the laws passed since then. It's claimed the lives of over 1,275 patients by overdose of barbiturates. And let's look at the claims made for them and compare them with what the law really does. First, is this all about the patient's free and autonomous choice? When you look through how the law works, the first thing you notice is there are a heck of a lot of other people involved who have their own agendas, who are not the patient. The request for a lethal dose must be witnessed by two people. One of those people can be an heir who stands to inherit on the patient's death. If the patient is in an assisted living or long-term care facility, the other witness not only may, but by law must be, an employee of that facility, which can have its own financial incentive to hasten the death of someone whose insurance reimbursements are running out. But the most powerful decision maker here is not the patient and not the witnesses, but the doctor who prescribes the lethal drugs and the doctor that he chooses to provide a second opinion, who could simply be his golfing buddy. Now, these two doctors, often from a list of willing physicians compiled by the advocacy group, Compassion and Choices, they bragged about what a high percentage of these cases they've been involved in personally. They decide the patient is likely to die in 6 months. They decide the patient is competent to make a decision and that he or she doesn't need any evaluation by a psychologist to see if his or her judgment is impaired by depression or other mental condition. As a result, in Oregon, and about the same in Washington State, 96.5% of the patients receive no psychological evaluation, despite the fact that clinical depression is as major a factor in suicidal wishes among the terminally ill as they are among anybody else. In Oregon, despite the zone of privacy that covers these cases, a few individual cases have come to public attention. Many of you may know about these. A woman, Kate Cheney, who was initially denied the lethal dose because she had dementia. She had a hard time remembering her doctor's name. But her grown daughter, described by one doctor as somewhat coercive in her demand that what her mother really needed was assisted suicide, they simply found a more willing physician. A man, Michael Freeland, who is well known to have had suicidal depression for decades before he ever got physically ill, received no evaluation and was given the lethal drugs by a physician located by Compassion and Choices. At one point, legal authorities actually kind of raided his house because he was such a danger to himself and removed all his guns from the house. They left the lethal dose of barbiturates in the medicine cabinet. Because, well, that's legal. No, Fortunately, Michael came into contact with much better physicians who addressed his depression and his suffering and allowed him to reconcile with a grown daughter who was estranged from him before passing away comfortably later of natural causes. So the doctors decide all the important details of who gets eligible for this. Then after the death, the doctor who wrote the prescription is allowed to file the death certificate. And the state tells him to lie on the death certificate to list the underlying illness as the cause of death to prevent an autopsy or any other outside scrutiny. And that doctor is the only person qualified to report on what happened, though he's almost never present at the time of the patient actually dying. And so he simply doesn't know whether at that time the patient was competent, was coerced by others, and so on. State officials have actually publicly said in writing that for all they know, the doctor's report could be, quote, a cock and bull story. Yet his is the only report that matters, and the state says it has no resources and no authority to second guess it, nor does anyone else. I like to use the example of, if you've ever been stopped for speeding, and the police officer may have come over and said, "Do you know how fast you were going?" What would happen if the law said, when you say, "Oh, I was going exactly 55," he says, "Oh, I'm sorry, this darn thing must not be working," and walks away. How many speeders would we have? This is ridiculous as a safeguard. It's all the reporting is by the perpetrator. Amazingly, in 20 years in Oregon and 8 years in Washington, not a single doctor has ever complained that he himself did anything wrong. Isn't that wonderful? And that shows the safeguards are working. They've all said, move along, there's nothing to see here, and the state is actually required to accept that story. Once the state does its annual statistical report, based on those doctors' reports, all the original reports are destroyed. What's more, the two doctors' estimates about competency, about the patient even being terminally ill, and so on, need only be made in good faith. Now, that's a technical legal term. That's the loosest standard of all for legal responsibility. Everywhere else in medicine, a doctor has to obey the negligence standard. That means if you did something that did harm, and you should have known that there was a better way to go, then you are liable. Good faith means, I thought he was sick. I thought he was competent. It means almost no responsibility whatsoever. There's one other person who has more decision-making power than the patient. Whoever is the last person in the room with him or her, with that bottle of pills, who is almost certainly physically stronger than the patient. It may be a loving friend or spouse. It may be that impatient relative waiting for the inheritance, or a pro-euthanasia activist who volunteers to be present to promote his ideological agenda. No one ever knows, because the only person filing the reports, the doctor, is not present at the time of death 84% of the time. The state and its agents step away, having given this lethal dose of drugs to the patient or the family, with instructions on how to use them to cause death. The state steps away with that person alone with somebody else, most likely, and with the means of suicide or homicide. Supporters of laws like Oregon's are very fond of pointing out that a significant number of patients who get the lethal prescription do not use it. They die of natural causes later. They say, well, this is not the time when they're deciding to take the drugs. They're just deciding to have this available as a last resort in case things get really intolerable. And in fact, of the 218 people who received the prescriptions last year, 44 of them never took that dose. But that means that even that earlier psychological assessment that only 3.5% of people get at the time of the prescription is meaningless, because the real need for psychological evaluation, the real need for safeguards against undue influence, against coercion, against outright murder by somebody else, comes when the drugs are actually put to use, and at that point there's nobody at all there except the person who has agreed to help that patient take his own life. No safeguards whatsoever at the time when the decision for death is made. In light of the supporters' claim that getting the lethal prescription is the ultimate exercise of autonomy, we should notice that last year, 87% of these patients said they were getting the drugs because they were, quote, losing autonomy. By their own account, these are the people in the situation with the least control, the least choice. And I've just provided, I hope, some support for that proposition. There are a lot of people who might be stronger-willed and certainly physically stronger, who are very involved in this decision, who may have their own reasons for helping out. Nobody helped these patients regain their sense of autonomy, their sense of control over their own lives. They were just given the lethal overdose. 88% of the patients say they are, quote, less able to engage in activities making life enjoyable, which is something that could be said by anyone recently experiencing a chronic illness or a disability caused by injury who needs help and support. 55%, over half of the patients, say they're becoming a burden on others, on family, friends, or caregivers. Well, that feeling of being a burden is surely influenced by the feelings they pick up from those around them who are so willing to help out. And it's a feeling they pick up from the fact that the state of Oregon, all the able-bodied voters of Oregon, went out of their way to make suicide so easy for them while working to prevent suicide for everyone else. Finally, the patient's choice can be under pressure from the real power brokers in our healthcare system, those who control healthcare coverage. In Oregon, 69% of those taking the drugs have no insurance or only governmental insurance, Medicare and Medicaid. And the state's rationed Medicaid system readily funds assisted suicide while forbidding funding for various treatments that may prolong their life. In Oregon, as well as now in California, patients or their doctors have been told they cannot get reimbursed for further treatment, but they should consider assisted suicide instead. Well, that's some free choice. And that is why Compassion and Choices can proudly announce there are no reported abuses in these states. The abusers are protected by the law. Either they themselves do the reporting, or they're invisible to the doctors who do the reporting, who aren't even there when the important things really happen. Outside scrutiny by anyone else is prevented by the closed reporting system, falsified death certificates, and destruction of the original data. Well, what about the claim this is only about patients with less than 6 months to live? Now, I've noted this is only a guess made in good faith, and no doctor can be accused of misconduct for guessing wrong. Those predictions are known throughout the medical profession to be unreliable. We all know stories of people given a terminal diagnosis who lived for many years, and the experience with these laws certainly demonstrates that. More ominous is the fact that no one involved in the process seems to be concerned about that. In Oregon, the illnesses qualifying patients for the lethal dose are chiefly forms of cancer, but increasingly they include conditions with far less predictable trajectories toward death. Chronic heart and lung disease. My mother had most of those in her 80s and survived for years with them. Parkinson's, diabetes, and most recently, even benign tumors. 3 patients in Oregon have qualified for the lethal drugs with no listed illness at all. In the last 4 years, 51 patients who died from taking the drugs in a given year had been diagnosed as having less than 6 months to live and given the drugs in previous years. So that was unreliable. Of the 90 patients who received the prescription in 2016 but did not take the drugs, only 36 of those 90 died in the same year of other causes. Now, this is policy creep, but it's not just carelessness. Proponents of the laws have said for years that they hope to broaden them over time to encompass people with chronic illnesses and disabilities. Those people can also be made by others to feel like a burden. Booth Gardner, the former governor of Washington, who was the leading sponsor of that state's law, said openly to the New York Times that focusing on the terminally ill was only a first step. And this is why disability rights activists, like the members of Not Dead Yet, are right to be alarmed at what this agenda means for them. The slippery slope is real, but it's not even a slope. It's the actual agenda revealed gradually, so the frog won't notice how hot the water is getting until it's already boiling. This was proved definitively this past January by a Swedish investigator named Fabian Ståhle. He was concerned that his own country of Sweden was considering a law like Oregon's for people who are considered to have an incurable and irreversible illness leading to death in 6 months. And he asked a very simple question. Well, that prediction about 6 months, does that mean even with treatment, or does it mean in the absence of treatment? And he did something that I don't know why none of us thought of 20 years, over the last 20 years. He asked. He wrote to the Oregon Health Authority and said, so which does it mean? And he got a very candid answer from an official at the Oregon Health Authority saying, oh, this means people who are likely to die in 6 months if they don't get any treatment, even if they could have lived for years or decades with some easily provided treatment. So this explains why you're eligible for assisted suicide with diabetes. Every diabetic is terminal if you hold back his insulin. If you refuse life-sustaining treatment as a patient, or if it's denied to you by the doctor or the hospital or by an insurance company wanting to save money, you become terminal and eligible for an overdose of barbiturates. So these insurance companies really do bury their mistakes. So we've discussed choice. Do these laws serve compassion, the other half of the Compassion and Choices slogan? Only, I told you about the very high percentages of people who cite becoming a burden, losing autonomy, even just not being able to do the things they used to be able to do. Only 1/5 of the patients cite pain or even a fear of future pain among the reasons for taking their lives. And the drugs themselves can cause suffering. Last year, 2017, in Oregon, the drugs took as long as 21 hours to cause death. They've been known to take over 4 days, 104 hours. 34 patients have regurgitated, thrown up the drugs, or had other complications. And in a whopping 638 cases, we simply don't know what happened to them in their death agonies because the reporting physician didn't bother to be present or didn't report on that. 7 patients have regained consciousness and died later, generally of natural causes. Interestingly, just like the Golden Gate Bridge, there is no record of anyone ever trying that a second time. More troubling still is what these laws do to all of us, to our efforts to provide compassionate care or to receive it from our doctors when seriously ill patients do not have any intention of taking their own lives. One of the studies I've done that I published on the site of the Charlotte Lozier Institute, that's L-O-Z-I-E-R, I recommend it to you. In other countries like the Netherlands and in states in this country that have legalized this agenda, efforts to provide palliative care for patients with serious illness has declined. After the Oregon law took effect, reports of moderate or severe pain and distress among terminally ill patients increased. The state's commitment to hospice care went down. At a time when 1,832 new hospices opened in the rest of the country, there were 5 opening in Oregon. We see these trends in Washington and Vermont as well. Growing concern on the part of caring medical professionals about their professions and their states' reduced commitment to really caring for and comforting patients with these conditions. By contrast, efforts to provide effective medications to control pain have increased when states pass laws against assisted suicide while encouraging that adequate medication to relieve pain. Now, just think about it. This makes perfect sense. Why would a doctor or a society commit to the hard work of really learning how to solve the physical and the psychological and the spiritual challenges of the dying process if that toolkit includes one little bottle of pills that solves them all at once? We get rid of all the problems by getting rid of the patient. Well, if a patient doesn't want those drugs, well, that's his choice. That doesn't put any obligation on me. Or to put it another way, why have you never heard of hospice care at horse farms? And the answer is, you can shoot horses. I like horses. I don't favor that. What does increase when a state allows assisted suicide? Well, suicides. From 1999 to 2010, Oregon's overall suicide rate jumped by about 50%. The increase nationally was 28%. In the last reported year, which was 2014, Oregon's suicide rate is 43% higher than the national average. That's in addition to the legally approved assisted deaths, which the state law forbids counting as suicide. Compassion and Choice's whole campaign in favor of its agenda violates the guidelines that are accepted nationally and internationally by our Department of Health and Human Services and by the World Health Organization for media attention to deaths by suicide. One of their first guidelines to prevent people from doing copycat suicides, from taking this as a go-ahead to kill themselves when the times are tough. The guidelines say to prevent that bad result among young or depressed people, quote, avoid language which sensationalizes or normalizes suicide or presents it as a solution to problems. Well, that's the whole reason for the existence of Compassion Choices, to do exactly that. Often with heavily funded media campaigns and a news media that slavishly just repeats their press releases. So the casualty count from these laws in terms of increased suffering, reduced compassionate care, and increased suicide may be far greater than the number of people with illnesses who have been assisted in taking their lives. So, third, what future do we face on this issue? One answer was provided on March 9th by a post on the website of the Pew Charitable Trusts, which could have been a press release straight out of Compassionate Choices. It even uses their market-tested euphemism. It was titled, Aid in Dying, Gains Momentum as Erstwhile Opponents Change Their Minds. And it cites trends like the following. 4 states and the District of Columbia have passed laws allowing this since Oregon's law took effect. Now it's 5 with Hawaii. Other states like New Jersey and Massachusetts may be next. Gallup polls show increased support in public opinion. A recent poll, it said, showed 2/3 support, up from 50% support 4 years earlier. So what can we say about this seemingly unstoppable momentum? Well, first, that euphemism, aid in dying, doesn't convince anybody who is not pushing the agenda. The actions involved are exactly those which are defined as the crime of aiding or assisting a suicide in the great majority of states. Supreme Court said in 1997 that this is about assisting a suicide. Last year, 3 different courts in New York State, it was 3 levels, a trial court, an appellate court, and then the state's highest court. 10 judges in all, in one of our most liberal states. And these were all judges who had been appointed by pro-choice liberal Democrats. Those 10 judges said unanimously, of course it's about assisting people's suicides. You know, you can say all the euphemisms you want, but that's what it is. And yeah, we have a law against that. Here's something that I find very few people realize. During the time that 5 states now have passed new laws allowing assisted suicide after Oregon's law, following suit, how many states have passed new laws against? Have you ever seen a news report about a state passing a new ban on assisted suicide? 5 legalized it, 10 banned it, that didn't have clear laws before. Where do you read about that with your unstoppable momentum? In the past year, we have Hawaii has acted in favor. 3 states in the past year, Ohio, Alabama, and Utah, have passed new laws against. In the case of Ohio, they had a law making it a civil case, but in 2017 they added criminal penalties. And these 10 states joined 31 other states that had already had laws against assisted suicide, including doctor-assisted. and have defeated all efforts by Compassion and Choices and its allies to carve out exceptions for seriously ill patients. This year, already, Massachusetts and Connecticut, two of our most liberal states, one of which was said by the Pew Charitable Trust is one of the next ones to legalize, have already defeated their laws for the years. So have the other laws allowing this that were introduced but have now died despite lobbying efforts for them: Indiana, Nebraska, New Hampshire, and Wisconsin. So it's a good question to ask of news media. Why do you only report their successes if you don't work for them? I mean, why don't you report the news? Why don't you report that this is a very much alive debate in which there are more states acting against the Oregon model than for it? Public opinion. What about that leap from 51% support 4 years ago to 67% now? It turns out that 17 years ago, in 2001, Gallup showed 68% support, higher than this year. It turned out that support had steadily dwindled down to a half, and now it's popped up again. It popped up because, largely I think, because Compassion and Choices, with the enthusiastic support of People magazine and other airheaded outlets, publicized the very planned and engineered story of 29-year-old Brittany Maynard and her supposedly valiant effort to move from California to Oregon to get her lethal drugs. The fact that virtually none of the people actually directly affected by this agenda are below 30 years old didn't stop the news outlets from taking Brittany Maynard as the poster girl for assisted suicide nationwide. I think the puppy helped too, frankly. There's a really nice puppy in her lap. But, members of her family became paid spokespersons for Compassion and Choices. They've gone all over the country lobbying for this agenda. And in 2 years, support went from 51% back up to 67%. Can it go down again? Sure. In legislative contests and referendum battles, support for the general idea always starts out very high, and then it dwindles as people learn what this agenda means in practice. In Maine, Michigan, and Massachusetts, for example, some of them quite liberal states, most voters have rejected this agenda by popular vote once they learn the facts. But the Maynard case is a reminder of how powerful personal stories are to most Americans and how we need to present the personal aspect of our message as well. The message that illness can be faced with dignity and hope, and that the assisted suicide agenda has its own victims and raises its own problems. What happens if we don't keep raising our facts and arguments, if we do not witness to a better way to face illness without extinguishing those who suffer from it? We have recent evidence in Oregon of where that's going. You'll recall that once upon a time, Right to Die supporters campaigned to get tube feeding defined as a medical treatment like any other, so it could be withheld or withdrawn from helpless patients. Options to refuse artificially assisted food and fluids were inserted into almost all advanced directives, such as living wills. They said, this is very different from oral feeding. This is technology. This is not like that basic care for the helpless that we do by feeding them through the mouth. So now they've turned around and said spoon feeding is an optional treatment after all. Two groups, End of Life New York and End of Life Washington, have developed advanced directives that allow a person, when competent, to reject oral feeding in advance if he or she later develops dementia, such as Alzheimer's disease. Oregon legislature has passed a bill, HB 4135, to appoint a new Advanced Directive Adoption Committee within the Oregon Health Authority, yes, the same agency that implements the assisted suicide law, and has defined terminal illness as one you'll die from soon without treatment, to draft a new advanced directive form for use throughout the state. A very visible supporter of that law is Bill Harris, who tried to get a health facility to deny spoon feeding to his wife Nora when she was in the last stages of Alzheimer's. He sued the facility in court because they kept feeding her, and he lost. As the court noted, whatever Mrs. Harris may have thought she would want in the past, She was willingly opening her mouth to take nourishment in the here and now, action which her husband described as a reflex. He is campaigning to be appointed to the new Oregon Committee. So here's the future if we let these groups run our public policy. 3 steps. First, get feeding by mouth defined as optional treatment that can be refused in advance. Second, health facilities and the general public recoil at the idea of health professionals having to stand by as they deliberately let people starve to death. Third, since the denial of food renders all these people terminal by the Oregon Health Authority's definition, because food is treatment and they're dying without treatment, let's get aid in dying incorporated into the advanced directives as the more humane solution, so a great many elderly people with Alzheimer's or other mental problems can be put to death, presumably in this case by lethal injection, because self-administered pills won't work. So dementia or other mental incompetency, the factors we were told should exclude people from being eligible for assisted suicide, will be the very terminal illness that qualifies them for assisted suicide. And then we will be exactly where Right to Die supporters told us we would never be. We will be the Netherlands, unless we call them out now. So, finally, only have a minute, but I've said legalizing this agenda is not about patient choice, not about compassion. What is it about? I think it's about prejudice. I think it's about discrimination. I think it's about a view that some people's lives objectively have less value and dignity than other people's lives. Because once we've made the distinction between worthwhile and relatively worthless lives, and only then does it make sense to address suicidal feelings with suicide prevention for most people and suicide assistance for just one class of people. We, the generally able-bodied of society, decide that their suicides will be good suicides. Good for them, good for the rest of us. And we decide that by law in advance of the decisions that any individual actually makes, so that we announce in advance when they are tempted to this, we're right behind them, eagerly waiting to help. That policy surely will not influence anyone to have those feelings of despair in the first place. So this agenda rests on the premise that we're very familiar with, that some people's lives don't have the value of others. And only then do we see that person's self-destruction as nothing more than a mere personal choice, because there's no important value to counterweigh the value of choice, as there is for everybody else. And once we take that step, every seriously ill or disabled person's life is demoted from being the just and natural respect for one's own life into a mere personal whim. And why should the healthcare system spend money on a personal whim? So the people most severely harmed by this agenda are not numerous enough or powerful enough to fight for their rights, or to make lawmakers treat them as having their own equal and innate dignity, with a life no less valuable than anyone else's. That task belongs to all of us, and I hope we are up to the challenge. Thank you very much.
Does that mean now that with this, people who are disabled, like with mental illness, are now worthless and can be killed at any time?
I think that's the message being sent by these laws, because, look, everybody who needs help to survive and get around, and that means a lot of people with disabilities, are terminal if you just deny them that help. And that's what, you know, the folks in Not Dead Yet have been saying. They've been saying, look, I've known lots of people who are terminal in that sense, who they may even need a ventilator. You know, they need a wheelchair, they may even need a ventilator with their wheelchair so they can keep breathing. They need supportive technology, they need care, they need medication. If you say I'm terminal as soon as you stop spending on that for me, then you know, and that causes me to become depressed and stop having value in my own life. I'm right along in that process. And so I think it does send that message. Well, certainly if oral feeding is treatment, and I am I am currently well treated, then yeah, potentially we're all terminal. Yeah. So.
So there are those of us who are Oregon donors right now on our driver's licenses. Do you have information, or can you direct us to find out how we can get our names off that?
You might want to ask our luncheon speaker about that. I'm not sure. Yeah. But I mean, I think there are different ways of determining death, and I think all of the ones that are available to us can be used or misused. So I'm not sure I would agree with everything the lunch speaker said, though she spoke very well. But I don't think, I think in this case, I mean, Jack Kevorkian tended to trivialize his own agenda by saying that his main reason for killing people or helping them kill themselves was to get organs for people who had a better use for them. You know, at one point on a street corner, he left out a cooler with his victims' organs. Said, anybody can pick them up, just go ahead, save lives. And people said, bleh. So I don't think that that's the agenda here necessarily. I think that it's more about saving cost that is better used for people who have more valuable lives. And I think it's about divesting ourselves of the burdens of caring for our dependent elderly when they need our help the most. You know, spoon feeding is, you know, that's something I did for a lot of our kids, even when they didn't like the taste of strained peas. And I am demanding that they return the favor when I'm old.
Several years ago, before we got our new physician-assisted suicide bill, I debated Derek Humphrey at Lincoln High School over at the coast. And we got to one point at it, and I said, it's not illegal to commit suicide. I don't know why we need this bill. And of course, the kids all argued, and he finally said to me, she's correct. And I said, I rest my case. What else do you want to do? And he admitted lethal injection. Where were we when all that happened?
Yeah, that's been something that's puzzled me for a long time. I mean, some of the statements have been made by the supporters, and you know, I mentioned Kevorkian already, who's a pretty weird guy, and by Derek Humphrey. Ed Booth Gardner, who I did mention, I mean, should have alerted people a long time ago to the fact that this is about something else than just, you know, solving some pressing problem that that people have no way out of. He wrote a book, is ironically called Freedom to Die. He's the co-author of the book. And he said that in the future, well, he said actually, he had a chapter called The Unspoken Argument. The unspoken argument is civil rights, autonomy, none of those things is going to drive assisted suicide to victory. It's going to be cost. And he said, you know, it's these greedy geezers, I'm one, these greedy geezers that are eating up our resources. And in the future, yes, it can be voluntary, but any elderly person who wants to keep living should be persuaded to realize that it's their personal responsibility to go along with this, you know, and stop having that whim about continuing to live. So that's been a puzzlement to me. And the only thing I can say is, it was mentioned by our wonderful morning speaker, there are a lot of folks who operate on denial. And they don't want to hear that fact. It gets in the way of the narrative that this is all about compassion and care and so on. But yeah, I mean, there are people who, I mean, I hate to say this, but is there really anybody, even if they're kind of weak, who can't figure out how to kill themselves if they really wanted to? I think the difficulty is staying alive, especially in cities nowadays. Yeah.
So you mentioned that for some people that receive the medication do not go through with it and instead die of natural causes. Do you know what happens with the medication when it's not used?
Oh, that's a wonderful question. There's a part of my talk I had to skip over that. Yeah, so what happens is you have hundreds of lethal doses of barbiturates, 90 pills, with instructions on how to use them to kill somebody, and nobody knows where they are. I mean, you talk about the opioid epidemic. Why isn't somebody looking into this? And some of the newer laws say, we ask the survivors to please dispose of this in a responsible way. Nobody knows. Yeah, it's the most irresponsible, just in terms of controlling potentially dangerous drugs, the most irresponsible policy in the world.
I'd like to know what you recommend we do next, as the same question from this morning about all the genetic testing and they're doing. What do you recommend we do?
Yeah, well, that's a big question. I would say first, get informed. It's so easy to, and on this issue especially of assisted suicide, the news reports are largely worthless. They just repeat, oh yeah, in 20 years there's never been an abuse in Oregon. So, be informed. I'm egotistical enough to think some of the stuff I've written, like on the Lozier Institute, and some of it is posted at Physicians for Compassionate Care as well, might help you with some facts for some of that. Respond to stupid columns and editorials who assume that everything's just fine. Raise questions like, gee, what happens to those hundreds of lethal doses that are out in the population, never get used? Could it have something to do with the fact that our suicide rate is 43% higher than the nation? Write letters to the editor. Take part in radio talk shows. Talk to your neighbors and friends about this and tell them, I've been hearing that this nice smooth thing that's working perfectly ain't. And I think it's the same thing we do with all of our issues, and speaking the truth in love. That's the short answer.